just get a live recording of the person doing their thing and treat that like an overhead mic, like you had a mono overhead mic. You know, you're gonna high pass it to get the junk out. You're going to time correct it the same way, because you can't just cut overhead. You can't gate overheads and sequence them like you would a kick or a snare or something. You have all the in-between sounds that are super, super important. So that's kind of how you approach a live beatbox take. But just like if you were mixing drums, you can line up samples with that, and you can sort of hide samples in that sound if you want to hide them, or you can have them be really obvious if that's what you're going for. But you kind of start with that and treat it basically like a mono overhead mic, and then fill in all the things you need. And that's how there are a handful of beatboxers in the world who could beatbox a song and give you a consistent kick drum pitch, but they're humans. More than likely, it's going to drift by, it could be anywhere from 70 hertz to 120 hertz to 50 hertz over the course of a song. And, you know, if you mix kick drums, you know, you're trying to find the fundamental frequency, just that perfect sweet spot, and boost that. Well, that's going all over the place if you have a beatboxer. So you learn how to sneak in samples just to get consistency, and have the kick really hit the same place every time, so that you can tie it into bass and start to do those things.
Interesting. Are so you're using actual samples of like a human beatbox doing a kick, or you're using from that specific singer or beatboxer?
Ideally from that person. If they're really good, if they're great, I'll pull the sample from that actual song, just because that'll gel the best. But you know, the range of, if you had 5 drummers and one was a seasoned session drummer and one learned to drum 2 weeks ago, they could play the same kit and the sounds would still have a certain amount of consistency. Whereas with beatboxing, the better you get, it's like the actual kit improves.
Sure.
So sometimes with a beginning beatboxer, I'll need to bring in somebody else's samples. Whereas with somebody who's been doing it for 10 years and does it professionally, it could just be them, you know?
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, something else I noticed about your mixes is just how punchy they are. Like, I feel like, you know, you could like boost up, you know, you could put like an R bass or one of those like subharmonic generators or whatever to get those, you know, tones like to sound a lot subbier than a human could produce, but you still make it sound super punchy. Like, what's, you know, is it just like compression, just like regular, like you would with another kit?
Well, the main thing I do, which my mastering engineers hate, is I just turn the drums up louder than they should be and then make them squash it and deal with it. And I always love the way that sound. They always get mad at me, but I always love the way it sounds when the drums are too loud, and then you have to squeeze them down in mastering. But
nice.
Specifically with the low end, a lot of what gives a beatbox its low end is just air hitting the diaphragm of the mic. You know, it's really just like controlled wind. You just have to make sure it's happening at the right time and that it's not out of control or weird. But that's usually... Do
you recommend...
Go ahead.
Yeah, go. Oh, I was just going to ask, like, do you recommend using like a dynamic microphone for beatboxing, or do you think condensers are good?
So most of the time, a condenser is good, because probably what you're going to keep the most from a live beatbox take is the upper end of the frequency spectrum. Now, if you were doing somebody who was a really great beatboxer, you'd want to have the full spectrum, and different things work for different people. Dynamics are often a good choice, A, because you can beat them up. B, a lot of beatboxers are used to holding a microphone, cupping a microphone to get their sounds, whatever. So a lot of the times a dynamic mic is good for that. Sometimes the RE20 is not a good mic if they're using a proximity effect to get their sounds, because the RE20 tries so hard to get rid of proximity effect with the porting and stuff. So
right.
sometimes it's like you just grab a 58 and cup it and put it right up against your face, and you get some cool sounds that way. You know, you sort of abuse it. But like I said, with the beatboxer, a lot of the times the microphone is the instrument they're playing, sort of. So if they know how to do all that stuff, it can be really cool. But you also get a lot of beatboxers who, like I said, maybe they learned 6 months ago to beatbox for their college group or whatever. They don't have that control, in which case you're going to have them on a condenser or something, backed off a little bit, and then you're probably going to filter out everything below 100 or 200 hertz and replace it with, the consistency of samples and stuff like that. So it's really...
Yeah, I got you.
It's really different from performer to performer.
Nice. Love it. And tell us a bit about how you treat like vocal bass, because obviously you kind of have to like add a bit of, at least for the kinds of mixes you do where it's more like, kind of in the pop style of acapella, where you're kind of beefing up the bass, in a very inorganic but cool manner.
Right. So it's kind of like, if you think about string instruments, you have a certain size body and there's some variation, but there's only so many sizes. And you can guess, when a cello goes lower in its register, when a cello plays the same notes as a bass, right? It sounds different, mainly because of like the body of the instrument, and the bass can handle resonating lower because it has a bigger body. So there's all those sort of factors that inform where you're going to do a little low end boost if you need to, stuff like that. With people, every single person is totally different. Yeah. So, there are some people who can sing the low E of a bass guitar, but most basses, their range ends about an octave above that. So, like with anything recording wise, the first thing you have to do is really listen to what's there and listen to what's not there to figure out how you're going to approach it. Obviously, the more they have, the less you have to do to it. The track I sent you today is a group called Naturally 7, and they have one of the best vocal basses in the world. So for them, it was just EQ, compression, a little bit of saturation, but then that's basically it. Like he sang the thing, and he did those crazy low notes. Some people are really musical and have a nice round tone, but just don't actually go that low. And for people like that, then you might use, like subharmonics, usually an octave below what they're singing. And then you can either favor the bottom of their register or the octave sub, according to what genre you're doing, according to what their approach is in terms of, do they want it to sound organic, or are they cool if it sounds like effects? So there's a lot of factors, from what the singer can offer to what the genre is to their whole philosophy on what, recorded acapella should be.
Yeah.
But for most bass singers, the farther away people get from the middle of their register, the more they start to favor, the overtones of the note as opposed to the fundamental. And once you get sort of below a low C, you'll see that the fundamental really starts going away, and the octave above it starts becoming more prominent, just as the body's natural way of saying, oh, this is low, but we need to get some volume on it. Just to be heard as a survival instinct or whatever. So a lot of times you're just compensating for that. You're finding the spot in a person's voice where their fundamental starts to go away, and that's sort of where you're, maybe that's where you put the Pultec bass bump, is just to smooth out where it starts giving out at the bottom.
Interesting. Do you find like that you have to use separate channel EQs depending on which part of the song they're singing, if they're singing like higher or lower?
Sure. Especially with, depending on how it's arranged, because sometimes a bass will be imitating a bass guitar, and sometimes a bass will be just another part of a choral ensemble. So sometimes, say the intro of a song is choral. Well, the bass might be triple or quadruple tracked, high passed at 120 hertz, maybe a little EQ boost at the bottom, otherwise treated like a vocal, mixed in with the vocals, maybe even bust in with them. But then the song kicks in, and now they're mono. Now they're compressed basically to infinity, and they have a big EQ boost at the bottom, and they have a sub octave on it, and maybe you want to distort it. It's like it's just what's right for these 8 measures, what's right for those 8 measures.
Right. I guess I'm saying like.
About it?
I'm saying even to the point of like, let's say, in the same segment, let's say you're boosting all that stuff in the bottom and you're distorting it, but they're singing like a higher C, so the tonality of their voice is different than when they go down to like that low C for one note.
Yeah, I mean, so the big problem you run into is that, especially if you have a low bass who can give you below 100 hertz, the difficulty is that once you start boosting that, you start boosting all the plosives, and you start boosting hum and just anything that's down there that you would normally want to clean out, you're boosting to try to get those notes. So sometimes it's automating a high pass filter. Sometimes it's doing a lot of work with just snipping things out, or with isotope to get plosives out.
Wow.
So
Get to the trenches there.
Yeah, it can be a lot of cleaning or a lot of automation, or sometimes it's just easier to snip out a part, put it on a different track, and have your high bass track and low bass track.
Nice. Other than that, like, I guess, how different would you say mixing of an a cappella song would be from like a typical pop song?
So there are some things that are exactly the same, and there are some things that are pretty different. One thing that tends to happen is most a cappella recordings are done by groups who are performers first. Which is to say, there aren't a lot of people who just go into the studio and say, let's create an a cappella recording that's just however many layers and whatever sounds we want. It's usually based off of, we're a group and we exist and we perform, and this is the arrangement we perform. So it's not that that's the better way to create it. It's that just in the real world, that's how it happens to come about.
Yeah. It's like a band,
Yeah, it's like a band, except with a band, I feel like especially lately, there's more leeway to say like, we also have like a sequencer, or we also have the synth, and who knows what's coming out of the synth. You know what I mean? It's like when somebody performs on SNL and there's 3 people on stage and you're definitely hearing more than that. You just kind of accept it. Whereas with a cappella, people still don't give it that benefit of the doubt yet. So audiences still expect there to be more direct correlation between, like, especially with Pentatonix, they have a rabid fan base who will, know the 5 parts of the song. And if there's a 6th part, they'll be like, well, where's that coming from? So,
oh, wow. I didn't realize. that is...
Not everyone listens to it that way, but there are people who listen to it that way, and it somewhat informs the whole sort of world.
I guess if you're that big, you're going to have those fans that are just super fans. And like we all know, like, some of us know, I mean, I don't know if you're a Beatles fan, but some people just know a lot about how the Beatles recorded.
Oh yeah.
more than others.
Oh, it's like, well, here's where Ringo drops the sticks, and
exactly. Yeah.
So all of which is to say, sometimes when you're working on an a cappella recording, you don't just say, well, we need something in the foreground and something in the background here. Let's just make another layer. Usually it's, well, these are the 5 singers we have, and they need to be all the layers at the same time. So you're working with something where it's not, let me push this way in the back and let me pull this way forward, because it almost kind of all needs to be forward all the time to make sense. Occasionally it's not that way, but usually it's like, well, if I push it all back, then there's nothing in the front, or if I push it all front, there's nothing back. So you get into a lot of like, it's all going to be pretty forward, and the delays and reverbs are going to be what defines the back of the mix.
Interesting. I heard, Chris Lord-Alge talking about, mixing Green Day. And he was saying how, like, the sweet spot for mixing Green Day is, like, to make sure all 3 members of the band are up front.
Yeah.
It's like...
Well, it's one thing I think about a lot is even if you're doing... Because you could do any genre in a cappella, right? But even if you're doing pop, or even if you're doing some other genre, you almost have to mix it like a band, where the lead vocal is tucked in enough that it becomes about the bigger picture,